cloud. All right. So picking up from where we were last week, does anybody remember what we covered last week?
Charles Martel, the hammer.
Yeah, okay, there's something. Again, always the sign of an excellent teaching when there's a long pause after that question has been asked. If you recall last week, we sort of covered two tracks simultaneously. One of those tracks was the continue of the political situation after the decline of Rome. So what happened on the political side of what had been the Roman Empire, but then we also, which we talked a lot about the Franks and the rise of Clovis, and then the situation with Charles Martel, leading the Franks to turn back the further expansion north of Islamic forces. And then we got into Charlemagne and his coronation as the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day 800. And then the simultaneous thing that we followed was the rise of the papacy, which was looking at how what had happened because of the politics, how that had translated over into the organized church, at least on the western half of what had been the Roman Empire. So we were sort of going down a parallel set of tracks there that interact with each other, but also were unique to understand in their own sense. So did anybody have any questions about anything that we covered last week?
Nope.
All right. Then we're going to move forward, and I feel real compelled this morning because we talked a lot about history that's around the Bible stuff, and not necessarily directly, although we're going to get back into some theology today. I feel real compelled to, let me get this working here, to show this, because it's important to understand how we went down this path and why we're going down this path. If you remember, I said early on in some of the first introductory lessons that we're really looking to seek out how the church collectively has worked out the answer to the question that Jesus posed to the disciples in Matthew chapter 16, particularly in verse 15 of chapter 16, where, remember, he's asking them, who do you say that I am? And so, while it may not always feel like that, because we've talked about a number of different topics, everything that we've covered relates to exactly that. It relates to understanding how the earliest elements of the church address that and how we continue to work that out today. Who is Jesus? And answering the question of who Jesus is causes us to ask the question of, okay, who exactly is God? Who is the Holy Spirit? We probably have spent more time talking about the concept of the Trinity than I ever imagined that we would. But again, that relates back to the question here. So one of the questions I'm just going to ask to open up some discussion is, do you think about this question differently now after about 4 months of looking at our historical theological development and the historical development of the church? Do you have any different perspective on this question than you had before?
Oh, yes.
What's different about it, Mickey?
I'm beginning to realize that there's an awful lot of play by other cultures into our faith, and that sometimes it's very difficult to weed those out, and that we've got to be very cautious and do our homework. I'm extremely pleased with this class simply because it enlightens me as to how we actually got to where we are and some of the fallacies that the church has accepted and some of them rejected. So it's been an eye-opener for me.
Okay. Donna, were you about to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I have learned so much about the process of just the thinking and how different groups either did or did not come to the same conclusion and how that played out in history.
Okay. And I know, and of course, this doesn't bother me one little bit, but I know for some of you, this is not your thing. I know it's been a lot of history, but I hope I've managed to connect it to the theological development. Why the history, in other words, why does the history matter? What was the influence of the history on theology? And then the flip side of that is, what is the influence of the theology on history? I'll tell you the things that I've learned that I thought I knew better than I did, but some things that have surprised me. I learned a whole lot more. I knew about the concept of Arianism and the Arian controversy, and that is a heresy. I thought about it primarily from what I knew before as being something that was sort of, put to bed, put to rest by Nicaea and Constantinople. So, in the fourth century, that sort of all resolved and the church moves on from there. And what I've discovered is how the church in some ways didn't get to move on from that as fast as I originally had thought, and how much influence is still around moving forward with that, and how that continued to influence not only the next 400, 500, 600 years of church history, but how it continues to carry down to today. This is, as we talked about before, there's a cult, there's a sect out there called the Jehovah's Witnesses that are still very much, they are the modern day version of Arians. And so this is not something that has gone away. It's just something that's morphed or changed over time. But I just wanted to at least, put up the slide and remember we did have a scriptural basis for where this started and what we've been seeking to do. And ultimately, this is the question that we're looking to get to here, which is, who is Jesus? And when you answer that question or seek to answer that question, you start understanding who is God and who is the Holy Spirit. So just putting that in context. Moving forward today, we're going to pick back up a little bit on the groundwork that we set last week. And this becomes very important because what we're going to get up to now is today is the split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. But before I get there, we need to establish some terminology. So when I say Orthodox, what runs through your head? What is Orthodox?
Belief.
Belief?
That which is most consensus belief.
Okay, so commonly held, shared. Would shared be a good word to describe it? And it's a widely shared set of beliefs.
Agreed upon.
Agreed upon. Yeah. Do you think that we, denominationally as Baptists, fall within orthodoxy?
No.
Lloyd said no.
Our own Orthodox.
Yeah. And I think, Lloyd, you make an excellent point there. Why would you say no?
I don't know. Orthodox to me means following a really, really strict path, maybe. I don't know. There's
an element. Is it a fair thing to say, trying to summarize that, Lloyd, that when you say orthodox, that assumes that somewhere there is an authority that's dictating what should or should not be?
Yes.
That's part of orthodox? You can't have orthodoxy without an authority that's defining what is and what isn't the commonly held belief?
That's true.
Yeah. I certainly feel that too, and we're going to talk about that today, particularly as we talk about another way of defining orthodox. So I think that is definitely the case. But I think the other thing that's important to me, the thing I've been reminded of as we've gone through this study, is that so much of what we have that is our shared, common, understood, and I believe biblically correct views of theology as we understand it, come from orthodox in the other sense of there being an agreement that comes to be because there comes to be, not because somebody says there's to be. I think the good example is Nicaea as a council followed by Constantinople. So we get this Nicene Creed. I think the good point there is that that creed reflects what was already a common, or was growing to be a commonly understood set of theological ideas in Christianity. That was just documenting what was already in agreement. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, in some ways, documenting it was important because that clarified the areas that you weren't quite in an agreement on, which I think was part of what was there. And there's no doubt that, for example, as we've talked about at length, Nicaea and Constantinople, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of debate going back and forth about the ideas that we know as Arianism, this idea of who is Jesus creator or created, and exactly what his role is. But it's that overcoming this modern thing that has to be overcome constantly in apologetics, which is this idea that, well, the council met together and they declared what books were going to be part of the New Testament, and they intentionally excluded other things. That's true, but it's not that the council made a decision about what constituted the New Testament, because the New Testament, what books were part of the canon, what book were already in agreement by the vast majority of Christians. They just documented what was already the agreed understanding. Now, in doing so, there were those that were outside of that agreed understanding, and there was discussion about it. But this idea of an authoritarian, putting it down and this is the way it is kind of thing is reading back into history something that really didn't happen. Okay, good. So moving forward, we're going to pick up today and we're going to end up with the Orthodox Church. And the reason I make that distinction and talk about Orthodoxy is Orthodox is going to come to mean something different after essentially 1054 AD. It's now going to refer to a segment of the church, the Orthodox Church, which is primarily the eastern wing of the Christian church. So just want to establish when we use Orthodox here, we may use it to describe the commonly held set of beliefs going all the way back to literally the church in Acts. But it also later comes to mean something that is slightly different when we're talking about the Orthodox Church itself. So here's what's important to understand, picking back up from the thing that we set before. We've talked about this a lot. The Roman Empire got divided into two halves, right? Remember that? That was done under Diocletian intentionally. Constantine reunites the two halves, but then the two halves split again. And ultimately what happens politically is you end up with the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire is centered in Rome. The Eastern Empire is centered in Constantinople, the new city that Constantine had built. And remember, eventually the Western Empire falls in AD 476. And so politically there ceases to be a Western Roman Empire based in Rome, but the empire that's based in Constantinople continues. It actually continues together until the mid 15th century. It's around for another 1,000 years in some way, shape, form, or fashion versus the one that was in the West. Well, what actually also happens is that there's the split in the political empires, but there is a split in how Christianity plays out as well. And so we end up with what I'll just broadly use, to use a common term, the Western flavor of Christianity and the Eastern flavor of Christianity. So when I say that, how much do you think those two are alike, or how much are they different?
Back then or today?
I'm sorry?
Back then or today?
Yes.
You mean the Western and Eastern churches?
Yes.
Well,
Well,
the problem is a lot of it is exactly the same, but then there's points where they don't agree at all.
So how many of you have had the privilege of being inside of, at any point, any flavor of Eastern church, or a Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, any type of church that is not part of the Western Christian tradition? Any of you actually been in, for example, any of those churches, actually physically been inside of their worship space?
I went on
It's
a couple
Albert.
of mission trips to, go ahead, Albert.
Go ahead, Albert.
Oh, I was just going to say I've been to one, and the inside was it wasn't like a Catholic church where it was really had a lot of decoration, but it did have all the saints, and it did have maybe some documentation on the wall, like art, but it wasn't really like elaborate like a Catholic church. And then the mass seemed kind of the same, except of course it was read in Greek. So
right. So language was one of the differences. The actual physical space was different. For me, my experience has actually been thanks to the Greek Festival. If you've ever been to the Greek Festival here in Houston, which is put on by the Greek Orthodox Church here in Houston, it's their major fundraiser each year. The chance to actually go in, one of the things that's there is to actually go in and get sort of an orientation or a chance to look inside of their, I guess, chapel. Is that the best way to describe what it is? It's absolutely beautiful. I would encourage doing that if for no other reason. It's just absolutely beautiful to see. But I know one of the interesting things there, I'll tell a story here, is that the company I used to work for, we used to make it a habit every year of going down normally on the Thursday or the Friday of the Greek Festival and going and doing lunch there. And as a result, we did that one year, and we went in and did the thing that was there actually in the sanctuary, where you would go in And the priest actually gives a little bit of orientation about, in this case, it's Greek Orthodox, which is an Eastern Orthodox sect. And so he was describing things. Well, it just so happens that one of my coworkers grew up in a very, very, very Catholic background. And she actually was so offended by one of the things that happened there that she physically got up and left the space. And what she was so offended about was the fact that in the Greek Orthodox Church, if you're a priest, what can you do that you can't do if you're a priest in the Catholic Church? Marry. So for her, the very concept of the person that was standing in front of her who called himself a priest, and the fact that he was married and had a family, was offensive enough to her that she got up and left the space.
Wow.
Wow.
Which I think I would characterize that as an overreaction, but she was sincere about it. So that's just one example of, that may seem like a small difference to me overall, because let me just say this right up front. I believe that our brothers and sisters in the Eastern Church are our brothers and sisters in Christ. We may differ on some things theologically, but I do believe that they have a saving faith in Christ. So while we may differ, we share the name. I don't know if my coworker, her name was Jean, I don't know if Jean would have agreed with that because of the way that she responded to that. So while that may seem like a small thing to me, it obviously was not a small thing to her. And so I just use that as, that's a modern example. I mean, that happened less than 20 years ago. It happened here in Houston, and I physically saw it, saw the differences between the two. So while there are similarities, as Albert pointed out, there are obviously differences. You talked about the language that the Mass was conducted in, right? Greek is different than Latin or English. And so the language was an issue there.
But to somebody who didn't grow up Catholic or Eastern Orthodoxy, to me, the inside of the churches look similar in their painting of the saints. Maybe in the Greek Orthodox church that I've been in, it's a painting on a wall rather than a painting on a canvas. But the appearance, okay, I can't even remember what it's called. The front where the communion is, where the communion and all of that. In a Catholic church, it looks different than it did in the Greek church.
Right.
But to me, because I grew up in a Baptist church, we don't have all of that. They looked much more fancy and Renaissance. I mean, the paintings look very similar. The style of the building is very similar.
Yeah. Well, even one of the things that I would just point out there, and the thing that ran through my head to talk about our own church is not the case now, but what up until 4 years ago, you had on the left wing or the right wing of the church, what did you have? You had a basketball goal, right? Because we were in a space that was multi-use. Yeah. I certainly don't remember anywhere inside of any Catholic church I've ever been in or any Orthodox church I've ever been in, among the things that were there were paintings of the saints, and oh, by the way, 10 feet off the ground, here's a backboard.
Or on the floor, the outline for a volleyball court.
Correct.
Or a basketball court. Yeah.
Now, not to say that, you may not have multi-use facilities across the world inside of either the Catholic or the Orthodox tradition, but I think you get my point in the sense of what you would expect the worship space to be. What happened as we talked about the political split that happened in the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire is eventually Christianity went down two different paths to a degree inside of each part of those. And so they do start disagreeing over issues that at some places may appear minor, but also became somewhat major. We're going to come through some of those things today. But the thing we're going to spend some time talking about the differences in theology today, because that's important. That ties back to what we've been doing. But I want you to understand today the major difference in theology between the Eastern Church and the Western Church ties back to authority. Who has the authority? And that's as much as the individual subjects over which there is disagreement, when you go through the narrative here, you're going to discover the disagreement is also over, okay, who gets to decide that subject? And that's also a major change that happens between the two churches. So I've got a summary chart here, and basically we're going to be leading up to what is referred to as it actually goes by a couple of different names, and it's important to establish this. I learned this and still want to call this the Great Schism. What's a schism, by the way? Just so we're all on the same page with that.
A split.
A split. It's a split in something. In this case, it's a split in the church. And I was always taught the 1054 schism, the term Great Schism was applied to that, and I still think that's the appropriate thing to say. It's also sometimes called the East-West Schism. And the reason for this is we're going to have additional schisms that happen in the church. We're going to run into a situation as we start heading down the path of talking about the development, moving towards the Reformation. There's going to be a papal schism in the Western church, where for a period of about, 70 years, there's two different popes that are both claiming authority. So there's a papal schism that happens in the 14th century. And then you might argue that the Reformation, which is going to come along, which is a major event in the early 16th century, is also a schism. And so sometimes there are some historians that will use Great Schism to apply to the Reformation. They will use it to apply to that papal schism. So if I use the term Great Schism, I'm particularly talking about 1054, when the Eastern and Western church fully split. So the Eastern church is centered in the Eastern Roman Empire, what will come to be called the Byzantine Empire, because of Constantinople taking over and becoming where Byzantium is. And the Western church politically centers around the Holy Roman Empire. We'll come back and talk about that. So do you remember back when we talked about this some while back, this idea that at the Council of Constantinople, there were 5 particular cities that were called out to be, if you will, the bishops in those cities were deemed to be not necessarily superior to each other, to other bishops, but they were called out as having a special position. Anybody remember that discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
And so if you remember, those cities were Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. And this was actually codified in some of the latter stuff in the Second Ecumenical Council, the one that was there in Constantinople in the 380s. And so those areas were sometimes referred to as sees, S-E-Es. They were sometimes referred to as bishoprics, but the term that often came to describe them was they were also considered patriarchs. And the understanding at that point in time was that there were 5 of them, and none of them were superior to each other. So they each had a role of being responsible for their area, but they were not in charge of each other. So there still was an understanding that things were going to be decided in an ecumenical council kind of way. That changes with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and what we talked about last week, which is the rise of the position of the Bishop of Rome, which is one of the titles that the Pope carries. Any questions about that? Because that's going to be an important thing that we're going to cover all the way through here. There was this designation of these 5 principal patriarch positions in the 380s at Constantinople, and the fact that changes over time.
So all of this stuff on this chart is what's considered part of the schism.
These are elements of the schism. So one of the elements is this claim of what this chart here, which you can see where it comes from. It's from a Zondervan text. The claims of the papacy is that the Western church grows to eventually hold the position that the Bishop of Rome has a position of supremacy or authority over the entire church, not just the area that the Bishop of Rome was sort of responsible for in the Constantinople declaration. The Eastern Church does not deny that there's a Bishop of Rome and that it's not important, but they would consider the Patriarch of Constantinople, just like they would consider the patriarchs in Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, to be essentially, these are all first among equals, but they are equals. So we're going to be talking about individual theological points here as we move through this, but understand one of the primary differences, Eastern Church versus Western Church, is who is in charge and who gets to say. We're going to see that there was not as much development in the Eastern Church after the Council of Chalcedon or Chalcedon in terms of theology, where there continues to be growth in the Western Church. We're going to come back and talk about the Philokae controversy. That's actually one of the major points here. And the other major point of differences is actually over the concept of icons. And so it's sometimes referred to as the battle of the iconoclasts or the iconoclastic controversy. So when I use the term icons, what does that conjure up for you?
Computers.
Computers. Icons are little symbols, right? Hadn't thought about it that way, but that's a good point. We still use that term just in a different way in the computer age.
Well, it also conjures up somebody to be worshipped, and I think that might be why the Eastern Orthodox Church did not want statues. I'm guessing.
And understand first of all, why do you think we talked about this both in Catholic churches and in Eastern churches? They tend to be much more, I don't know if decorative is the right word, but I'll use that. There's a lot more ornate. Ornate's probably a good word. Those images can be in the form of statues. They can be in form of paintings. Why do you think the church would have all of those things in the church? What's the value of having a painting of Jesus or a statue of Jesus in the church?
Remembrance worship.
Okay, remembrance worship. One of the other things to remember is how widespread is literacy even at this point?
Not. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And since people couldn't read a picture, a statue, a picture, something they could hold or see, expressed lots of things to them.
Yeah. I know, Mickey, you can probably speak to this because of your connection and understanding of what goes on in missionary movements, but I think most here have heard this before. Very often when missionaries go in to talk to people groups where the language is a barrier, what's often used there to convey the gospel?
Pictures.
Pictures. Before, for example, the scriptures may be translated into that tongue if it's never happened, they're able to use pictures to illustrate who Jesus is, stories from the Gospels, that type of thing. Pictures can be very powerful. I'm thinking
we even do that with children before they really can talk.
So the idea of using visual images in teaching and worship, is there anything wrong with that? No. In fact, it can be as incredibly useful if you have a non-literate congregation or population, the ability to use, for example, I think particularly I think this is true of of many churches, the Catholic churches as well, but particularly I think the Greek Orthodox Church here in Houston, if I remember correctly, part of the images along both the sides of the church, and I've seen this in Catholic cathedrals as well, for example, will show the Stations of the Cross, right?
Right.
And so what you have there is a visual representation of the story of the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection. That's there as a reminder. It's there as a way of teaching and a way of illustrating, and can be very powerful. What is the danger of having statues and icons and pictures in the church?
Worshiping them rather than the true God.
Correct. And so I think of today very often when I see, any portrayal in popular media or something like that, it's not uncommon in a Catholic church for when someone walks into the church, what do?
Cross themselves.
And they kneel towards a representation of Christ. It may be a representation of Mary, or a combination of the two when they do that. One of the questions that you get into is this an aid to worship? Does it take the place of worship? And remember, what's one of the things that's one of the 10 Commandments?
No other gods before me.
Not to have an image.
not to have graven images, right?
Yeah.
So,
Hey, Don.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for me, it kind of sets the pace. Like when you walk in, you're kind of setting your focus. You're leaving everything outside, and you're saying, God, this is my time with you.
Right.
So when you walk in and you bless yourself with the holy water, like you said, you kneel, you're showing total respect, and you're kind of, what happens too is you're in a group setting and you're showing everybody that you're in accordance, everyone's together, you're at a certain level. If somebody's not doing that, then maybe they're new to the church and they don't know exactly what needs to be done. So then you talk to them and help them out.
Hey, Albert, I have a question for you since you're familiar with it.
I'm not 100% familiar, but I'll talk on experience.
No, but this is a question I think, I mean, I worry about, for me, the traditions that I grew up with, that sometimes they become rote. You've done it, you don't think about it. So I was like, for you, you're like, I'm setting this time apart. You mentioned that, but to some people, do you think they have the experience, well, that's just what I'm supposed to do? I mean, it's judgmental of me to say, you know, the baseball player that hits the home run and as he's crossing home plate, you know, kind of crosses himself real quick and points his finger up at maybe he's completely sincere in doing that, but does it also at some point just become I've done this all my life, I'm supposed to do it, and I'm going into the church now and I'm supposed to do it. I mean, I'm sure there are times that it's completely sincere, but then I also think there's got to be completely times where it's like it's done out of habit rather than done out of sincerity.
Kathy, I think what you're saying is it's more the ceremony than it is the actual thought.
Yeah, I mean, the tradition
I think
of
that
it.
can go. I think that can go with any Christian. That can go with anyone that believes in God. You know, am I burning incense and praying or meditating to myself, to God? Am I doing these ritual movements to get me in the mood to meditate? I think that it's a heart condition that we talked about, of people really knowing Jesus. You know, growing up Catholic, part of my entertainment at Mass was looking at those paintings and looking all around the church and seeing this story of Christ, you know, being crucified. So he was reaching me different ways, you know, and then also what it did is it gave my mom and my dad time to focus on what they needed to focus on. And so when they would walk in, they would, you know, bless themselves with the holy water. So of course I would do it. I would do whatever they were doing. But then there becomes a time in your heart that you really believe, and that's powerful.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You know, right now, I was going to ask Dawn about this too. Is I'm speaking with a woman that at work, and she's Catholic, and she knows I grew up Catholic, and you know, we haven't baptized Ella yet, and she's like, "You need to baptize Ella." And I said, "Well, you know, we dedicated Ella as a baby, you know, just like they dedicated Jesus at the temple." And she stepped back, like, you know, okay. And then she's like, "Well, you still need to baptize Ella." And you know, I was going to tell her, you know, Jesus was with God in his thing before he was baptized. He didn't get baptized for probably 30 or 20s or something.
Yeah,
He was 30.
If you believe he was 30 at the start of his ministry, and that, you know, that ministry started with baptism by John, yeah, he's 30 years old.
And so it's a heart condition, you know, and Ella has a great heart for God and for Jesus. And so eventually she's going to do her outward expression in front of the whole church, you know, because she wants to do it.
It's also the difference, you know, doctrinally about what we believe baptism is. Believers' baptism. It's that there's nothing. It is a special thing. I think sometimes, you know, the irony is Baptists, we even de-emphasize baptism's special nature because we don't believe that it has any role in salvation. But it's an integral part of expressing our salvation and getting somebody to understand the difference between those two things. That's subtle, but it's big at the same time. And
I do want to say also with my experience, like when I went back to Waco one time. I was talking to the father there, and we did approach the altar, and he gave me a dirty look because I guess I should have been quiet and stopped talking to him.
It's the interesting thing here, and this is something we haven't spent as much time talking about, but we will moving forward because it's an important part of what happens in the development of the church. Tradition is not bad, but tradition also can become too emphasized or too important. And, you know, it's easy to talk here about, well, you know, what about this? What about that? You know, the crossing yourself and doing the other things, as Kathy points out, is that just out of habit or is that out of sincerity? It can actually be out of both from the same person, probably in a short span of time. But let's don't pretend that we don't have Baptist traditions either, for example. You know, why can't we sing the third verse of a hymn? For those of you that grew up in the Baptist church, you know, we got to cut time here, so we always lose verse 3, right? Or the next to the last verse if it happens to have 5. Or the church that I grew up in for a number of years started the service basically every week with the choir singing a particular call to worship and or the doxology. That was just the way it started. So much so that if you did something different, for whatever reason you did something different, it was doing something different. You know, when did you in the church that I grew up in, when did you take the offering?
Before the sermon.
Right before the sermon. You know, normally, and you had a special music or something there was this, you know, and so when you broke from that, it was like breaking from something that, well, this is not right. This is not the way we do it. And so again, this is not just something that's a Catholic thing or an Orthodox thing. This is a religion thing in general, because this is not just even true inside of Christianity, but other places as well. And so getting back to our historical development here, one of the things that rose up as being a controversy between the two churches prior to the split was the role of icons in worship. And icons here included both statues as well as paintings. And as you can see from this last point on the slide, eventually in the Eastern Church, paintings okay, statues not. In the Western Church, it was okay to have either one. So let's talk a little bit about the history of what happened here and how this broke. Is that after the period of time with the fall of the Western Roman Empire politically, we talked about the period of time where Clovis brought the Franks together, unified them as being Christian. We talked about the scenario which ultimately leads up to Charlemagne being coronated by the Pope as the Holy Roman Emperor. During the period of time there, the papacy is the position of Bishop of Rome is growing and growing and growing in authority. We talked about that last week, how it also took on a political edge as well as a spiritual edge. However, where is the Roman Empire, the classical Roman Empire, centered at this point?
Rome.
Actually, no. Rome has fallen. It's in Constantinople.
Constantinople.
Right. So we call it, often refer to it as the Byzantine Empire. You see that even here on this slide. If you were in Byzantium/Constantinople, you thought of yourself not as a Byzantine. You thought of yourself as a Roman. Yeah, the empire had moved east and the capital had been relocated from Rome. But even though Constantinople is the capital, this is still the Roman Empire. And so for a period of time up until, the mid-9th century, moving into the 10th century, the emperor of the Roman Empire, what was left of the Roman Empire, because the western part of the empire had fallen, remember, what was left of the Roman Empire, the emperor was in Constantinople. That was the emperor of Rome. We'll talk about why that's important again, why it rears its head, particularly with what happened with Charlemagne in 800. But also the position of the Bishop of Rome was normally, at least, even if it was just a rubber stamp action, was approved by the emperor, not in Rome, but the emperor that was in Constantinople. Everybody following that? The Roman emperor still had a role in saying, yes, it's okay for person X to be the Bishop of Rome, essentially to be the Pope. So even though they're separated by geography and they're separated politically, the church still connects itself to what the remnants of the Roman Empire, which are now the Eastern Roman Empire.
So at the fall of Rome, now there's two patriarchs in Constantinople.
No, there's still the patriarch in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, and there's still the patriarch that was already in Constantinople. They're two separate individuals. The patriarch in Constantinople does not call himself, he's not the Pope of the Eastern Church. That's not his title.
But the one in Rome is the
Takes on, remember we talked about Pope comes from Papa, the word for
Right,
father.
right.
This idea that he is the leader of the church, not only in the area of Rome, not only the traditional role of the Bishop of Rome, but that he has a larger responsibility over the entire church is what tends to arise there. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about this over the next couple of weeks as we move through the development of the Middle Ages leading up to the Reformation, because that's the big thing that drives a lot of our modern theology. But the role of the Pope evolves, remember, out of the fall of the political system in the western half of the empire and the rise of the religious position, the spiritual position of Pope, also getting intermingled with the political vacuum that exists there. And so,
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have a real quick question. I think Kathy sort of asked this and you answered, but I want to make sure. So did you say that it was the Western Church where the idea of Papa or leader over the entire church developed?
That's correct.
Okay.
What will grow into being the papacy, the Catholic Church, as we know it. The Catholic Church is the Western Church.
Okay.
That role grows and evolves over time. It's not like an immediate thing, but we see in the 6th century, the first pope that comes along that says, I have an authority that's a little bit larger than just being one of the patriarchs. And what eventually happens there, and it actually happens over some of these issues that we're going to talk about here, which is why I'm setting up this background. As they start getting into theological debates, the question then becomes who has the authority to resolve what the differences are. And in the West, the Catholic tradition is that the Bishop of Rome, and why does the Bishop of Rome have a special place? This is an important place to bring it in. What's his claim to having a special position inside the church?
His authority is descended from Peter.
It's apostolic succession, correct. And that Peter was the first Bishop of Rome, and Peter had a unique position. Back to the question and the passage that there, because Catholics will look to this. And I tell you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. That Peter was, the disciples and the apostles all had a common position, but that Peter was, that's not where I wanted to go, but that Peter was first among the apostles. He was the lead apostle.
So, but even though Rome fell and the center of the church,
the center of the political Rome moved to
Right.
Constantinople.
just say that again.
The center of political Rome had been relocated by Constantine already from Rome to Constantinople.
But even with the fall of Rome, the setup of the church remains the same, and the church takes over some of the political stuff. And so I guess when I think of the fall of Rome, I think of the church kind of going away, but the church didn't
In
go away.
fact, just the opposite.
Just the opposite. The church actually becomes more important.
Right.
And that's the reason that the
papacy,
the
concept of
so
the
important.
concept of the position
Okay.
of the Bishop of Rome, who also could be called the Patriarch of Rome. grows in its influence because it fills a political vacuum. That's why we covered sort of what we did last week. And remember, we talked about the interplay between the church and the Franks and the church, how all of that plays together. That's how you end up in Western Europe with church and state being like this. They're together. That is not what the same thing doesn't happen in the eastern half of the empire because it's just different. There still is an emperor there. And in fact, that emperor is still exerting influence over even approving at least who the Bishop of Rome is. You couldn't, in theory inside it, because you're still part of the, because here's the other part that sort of got skipped over, but I don't want to spend a lot of time there. The Eastern Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, actually through military force and other influence, the Eastern Empire comes back and sort of reconquers part of the West. This is before the rise of Clovis and the Franks, and then ultimately the situation where Charles Martel leads the Frankish forces to turn back Islam and contain them back to the Iberian Peninsula. There is an influence because the Eastern Empire does come over and occupy some of what had been the Western Empire, including some of the peninsula of Italy. But it was still the case that even if it were only a formality, the Western Church, the position of the Bishop of Rome, would at least seek the approval of the emperor for who was going to be the Bishop of Rome, which had translated into the position of Pope. So when they get into this, one of the first controversies is here over this idea of icons. And so what happens in the early 8th century is we come along to a Roman emperor. Now, where would that Roman emperor be? Constantinople.
In Constantinople.
He declares, the emperor declares, not the patriarch of Constantinople, although he's in agreement with this. The emperor was actually Leo. And there's a lot of Leos here, which is the other confusing thing that can go on with this. He actually declares that icons should be removed from worship because it's a form of idolatry. I think we can understand where theologically somebody might draw that conclusion. We've already talked about it. And so the iconoclast, a word that we still use today to describe, that we use in a different context today, the iconoclasts rise to say icons, particularly statues, but really all icons need to be removed from the churches, and for 2 reasons. They're a stumbling block to converting Jews because Jews see them as being in violation of thou shalt not have graven images. And they're the obstacle to converting now Islam has risen. They're an obstacle to converting those that are adherents to Islam because of also the same thing against having any type of image as well. So we shouldn't be having them in the church because they're drawing away from our true worship, and it's a stumbling block for us to bring other people into the church because they look at that and they view it as being the worship of an idol. So we need to get rid of all the icons.
Icon statues, not pictures.
But pictures as well.
Oh.
Iconography in general, but particularly statues, because that had more of the appearance of being an idol.
So who again was the Leo guy?
He was the emperor he was the Roman emperor based in Constantinople.
Okay.
He declares this.
Interesting.
He's the Roman, and by the way, with the backing of the theological backing of the Patriarch of Constantinople and the church there. Here's what happens. The Pope in Rome, I forget which one it is without pulling my notes up here, says, nope, not going to follow that. Our worship includes, the icons are important because they help people be drawn into worship. They help us to explain because not everybody can read. And so basically his response to the emperor, this is now the Pope, his response to the emperor is, yeah, you've said that, but guess what? Nope, not going to do it. And so a controversy arises, runs for about 120 years, over whether or not there are going to be statues and iconography in the church. And this pits the Western church, which is refusing the authority of the emperor, the Roman emperor in Constantinople, to even make that declaration. The Pope, the Western church, the Bishop of Rome says, he said that, but we're not going to follow that. So that sets up conflict between the two. This goes back and forth. Now, the irony of this is at the end of the day, as we talked about this earlier, what will you find in an Eastern church, in an Orthodox church today?
Painting.
You'll find paintings. You will find iconography. After they go through this whole thing, they sort of come back to, it's a slightly different thing. You don't see statues in the Orthodox churches like you do in Catholic churches, but they actually come back to, yeah, images are okay. but for a particular period of time, for about 120, actually plus years here, this is a raging thing that goes back and forth between the two halves of the church. Sometimes it erupts in a much more violent way, actually with conflict. Other times it's just sort of a simmering issue that's there all along. But understand that this is a diversion between the two churches.
So was the Eastern Church considered the Orthodox?
They take the term Orthodox later.
Okay. Okay.
I wish I would have pulled this now because it's an interesting thing when you start going to look for images to populate your PowerPoint to teach this class. One of the things I keep looking for is a really good timeline of the church to go to. Most of what you'll find out there are promulgated by the Catholic Church. And so you'll see this thing where there's this nice line that goes all the way through saying, this is the true church. And you'll see all the branches off of that. By the way, when you do that same Google search, you will also find similar charts where it's the Orthodox Church that stays the big line in the middle. And then you will see that it's the Catholic Church that branched off somehow as being the diversion here. The idea about what is orthodoxy, right? And so the Eastern churches, which have come under the heading of Orthodox in terms of how they use that in a modern sense. And by the way, they claim they're Orthodox because they go back to the Council of Constantinople. What was agreed at the Council of Constantinople about leadership within the church?
The 5 bishops.
There's multiple leaders inside of this that are recognized. There's not just one supreme overall. So they would argue we actually are holding to a more traditional Orthodox understanding of church polity than the Catholic Church does. And they're right in that sense. The Catholic Church's position would be, well, that may be true, but in looking at how this really played out, again, the apostolic succession that goes back to Peter, the Bishop of Rome is a unique position and should have supremacy. So they fight back and forth over this idea of icons. That's one of the things that comes to the fore.
Does the Eastern Orthodox Church today still recognize the Pope as the primary religious leader?
They recognize him as the Bishop of Rome and the Patriarch over that area. They hold to a position that, which by the way, wasn't the case in 1054. We probably will have to get to there next week. But they hold a position that structure sort of still exists in theory, even if it's not actually happening in practice. Having said that, it wasn't until 2004, after 1054, that the Patriarch of the Eastern Church, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Pope, at that time it was John Paul II, actually got together and celebrated a Mass together. It took until 2004 for that to happen.
And then they couldn't even agree on
we'll talk
to say.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about, because this comes back to what's called the Filioque controversy, is an interesting thing happened when they did that together. And so was this a split in the church? Absolutely. For how long? 1,000 years. And back to your question, yes, they still recognize that the Bishop of Rome is an appropriate see or seat within Christendom, but not that it is superior to their position of any, in this case, and particularly the Patriarch of Constantinople.
But the patriarchs in the Eastern Church, the patriarchs in Jerusalem and Antioch and Alexandria aren't equal to Constantinople.
And the reason, or the important thing to pick up there, and this is where this ties back, is understand what happened. This is 1054, roughly the map that we see here. So here's the Byzantine Empire. Here's the areas that are still basically under the control of Catholic Christianity and the Western Church. What happened to Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch? We talked about this 2 weeks ago. What happens to them in the early 7th century, moving into the 8th century?
They fall under the Muslims.
Yes, so these areas that were previously centers of influence, particularly Antioch and Alexandria early on in the church, we talked about this before. Yes, they still have Christian populations here, but they are now under the influence and under the control of this vast, very quick spread of Islam that happened under the Caliphate. And so now where you had 5, what do you really have left?
2.
2. Constantinople and Rome. And politically, the Byzantine Empire and the remnants of what had been the Western Roman Empire that is now altered, the rise of the Franks, the other things that we've talked about there, the areas here that are under Islamic control that are in the Iberian Peninsula. But you see that the split is political here. The split also becomes religious, tied to those political lines. That's the point. And while we're going to spend some time talking about these theological differences, because they carry down all the way till today, what's important to understand is what is the fundamental disagreement between the church in Rome and the church in Constantinople?
Who the boss is.
Who's in charge? Who gets to say? And so, for example, you saw it here in the case of the icons. The Roman emperor in the East, backed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, says icons are bad, need to take them out. What is the response? The Pope in Rome, the Western Church, says, nope, I've decided differently, and therefore I've decided differently. We didn't get together and talk about this per se. We didn't call another council on this. We didn't come together as a group to talk about it. I have decided in my authority as ultimately Peter's successor that, no, we're not going with that. I'm a religious authority and you're a temporal political authority exercising a religious role. So ultimately the conflict here, yes, there's some theological conflict, obviously, but what is the core conflict? Authority.
Yeah.
This is going to be the core conflict that continues up to the Reformation, through the Reformation, and even down to today.
But you would think that how do you say the
Filioque?
You would think that would be the more important distinction regarding the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, it is. And we're going to talk about that because that ties back to things we've already talked about. It's a major difference theologically between the Latin or Western Church and the Eastern or Orthodox Church. I think that's worthy of talking about. We're going to spend time next week talking about this particular thing because it flows off of what we've done before. Because this is still the Arian controversy, still being figured out and played out, and we're now almost 700 years removed from we thought we had that settled, right? But the other thing, the actual thing you're going to be astonished about, what actually erupts in 1054? Does anybody know what the actual final break is over? Kathy knows because she was, I think, forced to watch a video yesterday. They actually, when they come to blows in 1054, and I'll talk about that next week, they actually come to blows over what kind of bread are you using in the communion.
Oh my goodness.
Oh,
Hey, Don, can I?
that sounds like a Baptist thing.
Yeah, what color is the carpet going to be, right?
Yeah.
Real quick, going back to that map you showed a moment ago.
Uh-huh.
So Alexandria and Antioch came under the influence of Islam, but what about Jerusalem?
It was and it wasn't. Well, eventually when we talk about the Crusades, because we need to talk about the Crusades at some point too, because they're an influencing factor. You eventually have the Crusader states here, which is where you have, for example, at one point there is a Christian king in Jerusalem at one point. And there's actually a thing that's there. So this is a contested territory it's been a contested territory forever. Today. Yeah. But it was during this particular time, it is one of the areas that there's some allowance by the Islamic forces at various points of being permissive of allowing Christian and Jewish worship there in Jerusalem.
Okay. So I was just trying to clarify when you said that, what was left was basically Rome or Constantinople and Rome, and then you only mentioned Antioch and Alexandria under the influence of Islam. So I was wondering where Jerusalem stood at that time when basically the Eastern and Western Church, I guess, were ruled by the.
And so here's another helpful map. This is AD 600. So this is before the rise of Islam, but after the division of the empire. So here you see the purple is the Eastern Empire. the various areas that were the Germanic tribes that have become Christianized for the most part. This is around the time of Clovis about to rise. Notice how there's the purple that's all sort of intermingled through Italy here. So even after the fall of Rome in 476, under Justinian in the late 6th century, like 576-ish, the Eastern Empire comes back and reoccupies some of the lands that had fallen to the barbaric tribes. And these were the barbaric tribes that had not converted to Christianity. But you'll notice that it's not on the map here, but where Jerusalem would have been, Alexandria, Antioch, they are still firmly under the control of the Eastern Empire. That will change very dramatically as things blow out. This is from when we were looking at the setting of Islam and the expansion of Islam. That will be most notable when it starts spreading. Alexandria falls in 641. Jerusalem is put under pressure in the mid 630s. Antioch falls in the late 630s. These territories all are lost from being under the absolute control of the Eastern Empire and under Christian domination and Christian control.
Okay.
After the Muslims took over Antioch and Alexandria, how vital was, or how extensive was the communication between them and the rest of the Western Church?
It varied depending upon the time frame that was there. Certainly the ones that were closer to Constantinople. And notice how much incursion, this is 1054-ish, 1050-ish. Notice how much incursion there's been. These are the Seljuk Turks. Notice how much incursion is. In fact, for most of the, Constantinople doesn't fall until the middle of the 1400s, but it basically is under siege or threat for forever, for 700 years, give or take, by the forces that are here. And so the communication that goes back and forth is at various times okay, but at other times gets totally cut off depending on who is occupying and how they're occupying. And of course, as the Crusaders will come across, we'll look at this later in time, they will recapture some of these territories for brief periods of time, decades at a time. And so the communication will be great, and then they'll be lost again. So we will pick back up next week talking specifically about these theological points and sort of conclude out and get to the ultimate break of the church in 1054 between the East and the West and how that plays down to today. Any last questions before I kill the recording?
I had one, like some of the border areas like Poland and countries like that, was there a tendency to go more toward Eastern Orthodoxy or Western Orthodoxy?
Eventually, the Eastern Orthodox Church conducts a number of military missionary efforts up into the Slavic countries, and what eventually is going to happen is when Constantinople falls, the Eastern Church relocates from Constantinople all the way to Moscow, which is ultimately what leads to being the Russian Orthodox Church. And so, in fact, there's a remember, what is the title of the Russian king or the Russian leader? Tsar, right? Tsar is a Russian adaptation, a Slavic language adaptation of Caesar. So the Russian czars think of themselves. In fact, there's a point at which Moscow sort of becomes the third Rome. There was Rome, there was Constantinople, and then there was Moscow. We'll keep moving Rome further east and further north over time.
And then I think the fourth, that's Britain.
Yeah. So to your question, the role of the Orthodox Church becomes very profound in, well, certainly there'll be an element of the Catholic Church later because of where Poland is further north in Europe. But certainly when you move further east of there into the quote unquote Slavic countries.
Mhm.
Very much the influence there is an Eastern form of Christianity. And in fact, the patriarch in Moscow of the Russian Orthodox Church is just one of the other. They've changed where these patriarchies are now a little bit because the map has changed, right? But that's still one of the patriarchs that's recognized inside of Orthodox ecumenical councils. He represents the Russian Orthodox Church. There's a patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. There are other elements of the Orthodox Church that tie back to language and culture there. They're all equals inside of their particular structure. The Russian Orthodox Patriarch cannot tell the Greek Orthodox Church what to do, and vice versa.
Interesting.
Which is why ultimately in the Reformation, why all this is important to us and how we derive where we are, church polity, how the church works in terms of decision making and who has authority, is an issue that comes all the way forward, not just from this, but comes all the way forward to us today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And becomes part of the Reformation. In fact, it's one of the major things that is, it's how Lutheranism is, well, very similar to Catholicism, how it is also different. It has to do with who has the authority. And while these theological things that we're going to talk about next week, the Filioque controversy, iconoclast, I'll even get into the whole question that erupts in 1054 is that bread you're using, leavened or unleavened in the communion. That's literally what it gets into. That's what the whole thing blows up over finally. Is which that sort of goes away as being something of a major point. But it's not so much about the theology here. That I know I've made this point before. It's not so much about the theology. It's who gets to decide is the main thing that I want you to grasp out of this. This is what causes the split between the Eastern and Western Church. And ultimately, something like that is what continues to play out through the rest of Western Christianity as we move towards and through the Reformation. Who gets to decide? Is the Pope the authority? Or is Henry the authority in England, for example? There, the controversy is not over leavened or unleavened bread. There, it's over something entirely different. Can I get rid of my wife and marry somebody else? But it's still the question, the central question is one of authority.
Authority.
Okay. I'm about to stop the recording.